Dear students, in the previous class, we discussed the nature of ethics. That is the first topic of the subject ethics. And today, we will discuss about the nature of moral judgment. And the description of the moral judgment is discussed in the previous class also. Now let us see the introduction of moral judgment today first. Moral judgment is a judgment of value. It is different from judgment of fact, we know. A judgment of fact is a judgment of what is. And a judgment of value is a judgment of what ought to be. A judgment of fact is a descriptive judgment. It is known as the descriptive judgment. And the judgment of value, that is a judgment of what ought to be, is the appreciative or critical judgment. Now from these lines we know that what is critical or appreciative judgment. Judgment of value, or that is a judgment of what ought to be, is the critical or appreciative judgment. Moral judgment is the mental act of discerning. Mental act of discerning means mental act of recognizing the situation, whether it is right or wrong. So, moral judgment is the mental act of discerning and pronouncing a particular action to be right or wrong. To decide the action right or wrong is depend upon our moral judgment, the mental act of discerning. Now, according to Mackenzie, a British philosopher, according to the observation of Mackenzie, the moral judgment is not like a logical judgment. It means that moral judgment is different from the logical judgment. Logical judgment is another judgment, and the moral judgment is another judgment. Both are different. We cannot combine the two observations. Moral judgment is not merely a judgment about an action, according to Mackenzie. Moral judgment is not a judgment about an action. Moral judgment is a judgment upon an action. So it is a judgment upon an action with reference to moral idea. This is the observation of British philosopher Mackenzie. Now from his observation we know that moral judgment is not different from logical judgment. It is not a judgment about an action. It is a judgment upon an action. We know from his observation this conclusion. And a comparison done by our mental act, a comparison done by moral judgment. Let us see. Moral judgment compares an action with moral standard. Our moral judgment always compares an action with moral standard and pronounces the action then to be right or wrong. First of all, moral judgment. First of all, we have to judge. We have to compare the action with a moral standard. Then after the comparison, we know the situation whether it is right or wrong. Then we pronounces the action is right or wrong. Moral judgment does not consider the nature of action. The nature of action is not considered in moral judgment. The moral value, rightness and wrongness are concerned in moral judgment. We must keep this in our mind. What is in the moral judgment is the moral values of the action, the moral values of the action, rightness and wrongness, not the nature. Then again, let us see one opinion, one observation of a British philosopher, Muirhead. Muirhead is also a British philosopher. According to him, moral judgment is not a judgment in the logical sense of proposition. According to the Mackenzie also, we have seen that our judgment is not a logical judgment. Similarly, according to Muirhead, we find that moral judgment is not a judgment in the logical sense of a proposition, but that is a judgment in the judicial sense of a sentence. It is to be considered as that it is the judicial sense of a sentence. This is the opinion of Muirhead. Then how moral quality of the action is recognized? How we recognize the moral quality of an action? The moral quality of an action is recognized in this way, like this. So when we perceive a voluntary action, we compare the action with the moral standard and then judge whether the action is in conformity with the moral standard or not. When we compare the action with the moral standard, when we observe whether it is in conformity with the action with the moral standard or not, if it is found in conformity with this moral standard, then that is right action. And on the other hand, if the judgment is found not in conformity with the moral standard, then it is wrong. And in other words, we can say that from the observations, we find that moral judgment involves the application of moral standard to a particular action. There is the involvement of the application of moral standard to a particular action when we perform moral judgment of an action. Then Now, it is clear that moral judgment is inferential in nature. Moral judgment is inferential in nature. Inferential means, say, for example, arriving at a conclusion from a given, say, evidences. Say, for example, all men are mortal, a given example, a given evidence, all men are mortal. Tomba is a man, another evidence, then we can arrive at a conclusion. All Tomba is mortal. All men are mortal. Tomba is a man, therefore Tomba is mortal. Like this, we come to a conclusion. This process is known as inferential nature in nature. So, the judgment, moral judgment from the observation, from the analysis, what we find is that moral judgment is inferential in nature, and there is the involvement of the application of the moral standard to a particular extent. But we must not suppose that our ordinary moral judgments always involve explicit reasoning or inference. The element of reasoning is implicit in most cases of the moral judgments. Then, now, when we may ask a question whether there is an object of moral judgment. Whether there is object of moral judgment. Yes, there is objects of moral judgment. And what are the objects of moral judgments then? Voluntary actions and habitual actions are the objects of moral judgments. Voluntary actions, all the voluntary actions and habitual actions are the objects of moral judgment. Non-voluntary actions are excluded from the scope of moral judgment, but the habitual actions are objects of moral judgments because these habitual actions are the results of the repeated voluntary actions. Thus, ultimately, only the voluntary actions are judged to be right or wrong. So from this we know that there are two objects of moral judgments. One is voluntary action and another one is habitual action. And both the voluntary actions and habitual actions are in the scope of the moral judgment, but non-voluntary actions are not in the scope of are excluded from the scope of the moral judgment. Then ultimately what we find is that only the voluntary actions are judged to be right or wrong. In this way, here we find what is the nature of moral judgment. We know something about, we have some knowledge about the nature of moral judgment from the discussion, from the observation of Mackenzie, from the observation of Moorhead, and the descriptions. We have some knowledge for the nature of moral judgment. Now let us see the summary of today's class. Here, let us see the summary the summary of the nature of moral judgment. Moral judgment is a judgment of value. This is the introduction. Moral judgment is a judgment of value. A judgment of value is a judgment of what ought to be. It is an appreciative or critical judgment. It is not a descriptive judgment. Moral judgment is the mental act of discerning and pronouncing a particular action to be right or wrong. According to McKenzie, let us see the observation of the McKenzie. A British philosopher rightly observes that the moral judgment is not like a logical judgment. Thus, moral judgment is not a judgment about an action, but a judgment upon an action with reference to moral ideal. Then, let us see the comparison done by the mental act. Mental act of discerning compares an action with moral standard and pronounces it to be right or wrong. Moral judgment does not consider the nature of an action, but its moral value, rightness or wrongness. Moral judgment consider the moral value, rightness or wrongness only. It does not consider the nature of an action. Then next, how the quality of the moral quality of an action is recognized. Let us see. The moral quality of an action is recognized in this way. When we perceive a voluntary action, we compare it with the moral standard and thus judge whether the action is in conformity with it or not. Then we decide the rightness or wrongness. In other words, moral judgment involves the application of the moral standard to a particular action. Then, thus, it is clear that moral judgment is inferential in nature, involving the application of moral standard to a particular action. But our ordinary moral judgments do not always involve explicit reasoning or inference. The element of reasoning is implicit in most cases of moral judgment. This is the end of the summary. But now let us see the difference between the judgment of fact and judgment of value by considering the following logic. Now let us see these two sentences. The first one, a mother cannot survive without a transfusion of her son's rare blood type. This is from this first example, first sentence. A mother cannot survive without a transfusion of her son's rare blood type. This sentence indicates a fact. Therefore, this is a judgment of fact. What is? On the other, let us see the second type of sentence. It is only right for the son to help his dying mother. Here, there is the involvement of the value. Therefore, this is the judgment of value, what ought to be. And again, let us see another sentence. Let us compare to two sentences. Giving blood involves no risk at all. Giving blood involves no risk whatsoever. This is judgment of fact. The sentence indicates a fact. is a judgment of what is. And the second sentence, let us compare the two sentences. The son ought to donate blood to his mother. The son ought to donate blood to his mother. There is an obligation. There is a moral obligation is here, involvement of the moral obligation here in this sentence. So this is not a judgment of fact, this is a judgment of value. It means judgment of what ought to be. Here, from these examples, I think you must have known the difference between judgment of fact and judgment of value. Then let us see some questions in relation to the topic what we have discussed today. The first one is, what is the nature of moral judgment? For 4 marks. What is moral judgment? For 2 marks. What is a critical or appreciative judgment? 2 marks. What is the observation of Mackenzie? 2 marks. What does moral judgment compare an action with? 2 marks. And what are the objects of moral judgments? 2 marks. Now, like this, we can have such questions in connection with the nature of moral judgment. Now, for today,